Did you ever look out over a lake? Think about something buried underneath it? Buried underneath it. Man, that's about as buried as you can get.
Well, I'm telling you, Louis, I don't want any part of it.
Well, you are part of it.
It is a matter of the law.
The law? The law? What law? Where's the law, Drew? Huh?
One and all, welcome. I am Nick Muniz. This is Nick's Nonfiction. Today on the show, we have got Kara Tabnick's greatest survival stories. Are you a thrill seeker? Are you looking for inspiration? Are you looking for stories to make you get her done? Do you love hearing about insane stories so crazy they can't possibly be true, and yet they are? Today is a bitter look at the bleak side of nature. The great outdoors, it ain't all sunshine and hippies. You guys know blue doesn't exist in nature? It's just a pigment of your imagination. How do poets enjoy nature? They go for a haiku. These stories seem too unbelievable to be true. Lost individuals facing the most severe natural disasters, the most dangerous situations, and the most inhospitable conditions. And yet, they came back alive. From plane crashes, to sinking ships, to surviving in freezing forests and dry deserts, this anthology of survival stories includes some of the most famous, unbelievable tales of beating the odds. If pooping is when nature calls, is a fart a missed call? About the author, Kara Tabashnik. Kara Tabashnik is a journalist who writes and reports about global criminal justice systems. She has written for publications about Oprah Magazine, Harper's Collins. She does like a lot of true crime, FBI most wanted cases. I try to stay away from true crime on this, just low vibrational gore. Okay, survival is about success stories. We're beating the goddamn odds today. Chapter 1, Greatest Survival Stories, the Peru Plane Crash. We got 4 stories today. Gonna breathe life into all of them. A blinding white light burst off the plane's fixed wing. The passenger on the flight screamed in horror. Pressure in the main cabin dropped. The tightly packed overhead bin snapped open and suitcases, books, and presents wrapped in Christmas paper fell into the aisles. The last thing then 17-year-old Julie Kopchik heard her beloved mother say was, "Oh no, this is it!" Very reassuring, Mom. Great last words. Oh no! You know what my last words are gonna be? Hasta la vista, baby. This was not what Julian had imagined when they arrived at the airport earlier that day. For their regularly scheduled flight from Lima to Pucallpan, a rural area in Peru, their plane's takeoff had been delayed 7 hours. The airport had been chaotic. Several flights before canceled. People were mobbed. The Christmas spirit, hordes of angry people at the airport. Finally, their delayed flight was given clearance for departure. 30 minutes after National Peruvian Air Lanza Flight 508 took off, passengers were offered a small snack and a drink. Hey, they get more than we do in America. Julian munched on her food, daydreamed, and stared out the window when the plane entered what looked like a very thick storm cloud. Julian was nervous. She loved to fly and even enjoyed turbulence. The plane began to churn as it entered the denser air. People started complaining that they should turn back rather than risk going through the thick storm clouds. Other voices rose in protest. They were only 15 minutes from their destination when a majority of passengers wanted to get home for Christmas, so the pilots pressed forward. The plane started to buck as it entered heavier turbulence, and the clouds grew darker. Lightning flashed around the plane. The passengers started to scream desperately, as if their screams could be heard. The deep roaring of the engines filled Julian's head completely, but then in the next moment, all the horrible noises stopped. The body of the plane broke apart 2 miles above the ground. Metal flew in every direction, raining and burning fuselages, melting steel beams. The body of the plane broke apart. Julianne was suddenly outside the plane. She opened her eyes. She was still strapped to her plane seat bench with a seatbelt across her shoulder. She saw a green dense canopy of the jungle spinning beneath her legs. "Where am I?" she thought. "You're falling out of the sky, lady." The dense trees, It was an unreal perspective to be dangling above the trees. The golden light of the sun spread through the leafy tops. She raised her head, then the airplane bench slipped, falling through the foliage that she had been admiring. Before Julian had a chance to fear what was really happening, she passed out. Her plane seat landed in a tree. This is a real story. Peruvian flight number 508. Motherfucker survived a plane crash. Okay, it wasn't putting your heads between your legs. That's what the flight attendant will tell you is going to save your life. Every single person on this flight died. But Julianne lived because she was saved by a tree. When Julianne woke up, a day had passed. Without thinking, she lifted her body, and pain shot everywhere. Yet nothing seemed to be broken. Her hands moved, her legs moved. There were deep cuts on her legs, gouges on her back and arms. Wherever she thought the metal plane scratched her, started to bleed severely. I've survived a plane crash, she thought. To remain alive, Julianne knew she had to make it out of the rainforest. She marked the tree where she had landed in a distinct pattern of leaves. Getting disoriented and lost among the trees was a real danger. Julianne picked up a bag of candies, for now they were the only food she had. She placed one in her mouth. During the crash, she had lost her glasses. She was very nearsighted and couldn't see far in front of her. She heard a tiny sound like that of a bubbling creek. She followed the noise and found a small piece of water in the ground. Larger body of water should be nearby. Follow it down to a river. So she straightens up as best as she can. She follows the sound of the spring deeper into the jungle, with only intuition to guide her. On her 4th day of wandering, Julianne found a small creek. Her watch, a gift from her beloved mother, had stopped ticking. Mosquitoes and flies endlessly buzzed around her, biting her arms and legs. Large welts had popped up on her entire body. Her wounds were starting to drip yellow pus and weren't healing. As Julianne walked around a curve, she saw a 3-seat plane bench rammed head down into a creek wall. The flowing water trickling around the heavy obstruction. Buckling into the seats were 3 passengers. Only the top half of their bodies, including their heads and shoulders, were inside the earth. They got lodged into a mud hill. Shee! You come across that on your 4th day of wandering through the jungle? Not promising. Julianne doesn't give up. Days later, her strength rapidly faded. Julianne stumbled upon the wide, broad mouth of a river. She felt a moment of salvation. Maybe she'd be rescued after all. Julianne knew if there was a river, certainly there was going to be a village close to the shores. Following the bends of the riverbank provided to be a Herculean task. After 5 days without eating, hunger had long since dulled. Her head throbbed, she couldn't think clearly or figure out which direction to go. Julianne decided to build a raft to drift the water in hope that the currents would bring her downstream to some sort of civilization. Huck Finn. She gathered some fallen logs, she lashes them together. At night, Julianne lifts herself out of the river, dragging the raft behind her, finding places on the banks where she could sleep. The unstable contraption soon broke apart, and Julianne decided to swim. On the 10th day alone in the jungle, toward the late afternoon, Julianne was looking for a slope or a big tree root where she could shelter and rest for the night. Then she saw a very large boat. She rubbed her eyes with her fist 3 times. Each time she opened them, the boat was still there. She wasn't hallucinating. It had to be real. Adrenaline raced through her body. Days of brilliant sunshine and blistered feet, leaving red burns across her shoulders and arms, had paid off. Maggots had infested the deep cuts that she received upon the crash's impact. She felt as if she had been scrambling for hours. With a last push of strength, she finally reached the top of the slope, and at the pinnacle, Julianne spotted a hastily constructed hut covered with braided palm leaves. There was no other sign of life. At first, Julianne decided to sit and wait. After an hour, no one arrived. By the late afternoon, as Julianne slept on and off, she heard the distinct sound of voices. Because it had been so long since she had heard an utterance, she thought maybe she was hallucinating. She poked her head out of the doorway to find there were several men speaking outside. To Julianne, it was like hearing the voice of angels. She hadn't heard another human in almost 11 days, and she'd been starting to think she would never again. Seeing a white-fair-skinned, blonde-haired girl come out of their hut, the men thought Julianne was an apparition of a water goddess. Born and raised in the jungle, some of the workers had never seen a white person before. They fed her little pieces of food, some bread, some flattened pieces of fish, and listened to her story. The next morning, Armando and Marcio brought Julianne to the medical outpost at the jungle camp Torna Vista. Julianne That's a survivor. You know, I love plane crash jokes, but they never seem to land. Number 2, the pit of despair. Just before 7 a.m. on March 10th, 1906, the courier's mind was already humming. There was no warning about the death and destruction about to come. As the main employer in this northern French... Good. A mine collapse to the French. They deserve it. The mine saw 2,000 men arrive daily, many of the quaint cobblestone villages of Bethune, just 18 miles away. The fateful day in March, just weeks away from spring, had chilly skies overcast. Winter's long arm still had its hold. Most workers had arrived at 5:30 a.m. After they charged into their mining clothes, they lined up and lowered into the subterranean pits. Nothing alerted them to the inferno waiting. Boom! In a split second. At the entrance of the Coriol coal mine was no more. A man's body split apart into molecules of dust from the intensity of the fiery explosion. There was no trace left. Plumes of intense heat destroyed everything in their path. Clouds of methane gas followed. The crisp air and the foul odor of rotten eggs took over. What does a Frenchman have for breakfast? Un oaf. In an instant, the mines were a fireball. Flames broke out along the grassy tops of the surrounding fields, and the noxious gases were overwhelming. Rescuers ran toward the pits, dragging men away who were caught on fire. Their hair, their fingers were burning. They pushed these young men to the ground in an effort to stomp out the flames. Maybe I should be a rescuer in France, so that way I could just stomp on French people. 400 local soldiers arrived to hold back the crowds of mourners trying to break into the mines. Let the people go try to save their families. You're just going to guard the entrance? They pushed these yowling men to the ground. Distraught relatives, they threw insults, they threw fruit and vegetables at the soldiers. Chaos reigned and quickly escalated as it became clear that the rescue attempt had been hampered by a lack of training. They send the military out there, they're not trained. And in very French fashion, a riot breaks out. The day before the accident, a fire was reported deep in the mines, but not extinguished due to a flurry of coal dust. The whole thing could have been prevented. The rescuers were never trained. It's a normal day in France. A riot breaks out. Things went from bad to worse. As the rescuers worked to bring up the men, screams kept coming up from the shafts below. Sacre bleu, somebody save me! The cages kept pulling up mutilated bodies piled one on top of the other, all completely naked with a slimy coating of sweat. The clothes had been disintegrated by the blast. Some of the miners were decapitated. These were body trunks without limbs, detached hands and feet. There were piles of bleeding flesh. The whole site was an evil-smelling, loathsome human morass. When touched, the blackened piles fell apart in bundles, like pieces of saturated tinder. The survivors vomited at the sight of their fellow brethren. Of the 1,800 workers, 1,000 of them were trapped below the surface. This is why the French don't go to war. They can't even go to underground. A 38-year-old guy, Henry, this is the survivor of the story. And this is France, so I guess it's Henri. Down in pit number 10, Henri and the men were desperate to break out of the tomb in which they were trapped. But Henri cautioned the eager miners not to knock down the rocks. The mine structure was unstable, and they needed to be careful. Henri decided to tear strips of rotting bark and chew the wood into tiny pieces. Guided by hunger, the men ripped dry bark into strips and chewed. They turned into beavers. They're eating the structure of the mine. You can eat wood. This is a survival episode. You got to watch that show alone. You can literally eat trees. Henry cautioned. They pushed it into the back of their throats. They're eating mushy paste. Eating timber. No wonder they fell apart. Henry knew the food they had to eat was next to was not going to be satisfying. If they were going to survive the mines, they needed strength and protein to get blood circulating throughout their bodies. They needed to eat meat. There was no doubt they needed to eat the horses. French people, I guess they're a step above cannibalism. But they'll eat a horse. Above ground, the mine company directors had called off the search and rescue. It had been 2 weeks. 2 weeks? Let's pack it up. Let's go back to drinking wine and eating cheese. 1,000 guys trapped below the earth. Let's call off the search. Down below, a sliver of sky appeared in the distance, and even the weak glimmer of light was too harsh for the miners' sullied eyes. They had been trapped underground for 20 days, and right in front of them was the freedom they had so desperately sought. It almost couldn't be believed. For the last few hours, they'd been following the draft of fresh air smelled by the weakest of the miners, Martin. Using their last bit of strength, the men covered their eyes with their arms in a valiant effort to block the harsh sunlight. In the end, 13 men made it out of the mining disaster. Over the past few difficult weeks, Henry had lost 7 to death. The men started to weep at the sight of the land of their freedom. 12 men made it out. 1,000 perished. I don't know, guys. 100 years ago, kids used to work in the mines. And today, Minecraft is the most popular kids game. These children, they yearn for the mines. Part 3, Arctic Expedition. For Christmas dinner, Ada Blackjack made some salted meat, hard bread, and tea to eat with her crew of the Stephenson expedition. She sent out plates and silverware for herself and the 4 other members of her team. There had not been much to celebrate over the past few months as they battled the desolate Arctic winter, starving in isolation. It was 1922 when the boat landed in Wrangel Island. Ada first thought that what they should do is turn back. The island was so remote. It took weeks to sail there. It was smack in the middle of the Arctic Ocean, 100 miles from the Siberian coast. For the first few months, the explorers trapped foxes, geese, ducks, seals, and even polar bears and walruses. But it seemed the animals had since disappeared. It had been ages since they had fresh meat. The ice had frozen the sea around the island so no boats could get in or out. The reinforcement that they were experiencing never came. The crew wasn't experienced enough to hunt in the cold. They don't know how to trap animals. They got limited ammunition. The plan was to walk 700 miles across the frozen Chukchi Sea Bridge between Alaska and Russia. They had slept the last week hauling wood to the camp and light a fire for warmth. Over the Christmas dinner that year, they planned their upcoming expedition, the bonfire lighting their lean faces. They're getting ready to walk 700 miles. On January 8th, the men set out, Ada waving them off from camp. Although she was afraid to be left alone, she had faith in her ability to survive. Just 2 weeks later, Ada looked up from her sewing to see the explorers straggling back. This time they were dragging a makeshift sled, and Knight was strapped to it. This is one of the guys, Knight. During the trip, Knight had become very sick, and they had to return to camp. So what do? These other guys, they're going to try to walk 700 miles again, through the Arctic. Once they were gone, the camp was quiet, with Knight lying on his cot, Ada caring for him. Every day, Ada went out to set animal traps, but they were bare. She rationed the meat from their rapidly dwindling preserves supply. The provisions are almost gone. Knight was conscious, but too weak to get out of bed. The meat runs out. Ada results to eating her pet dog. Take that, France. You'll eat a horse, we'll eat a dog. Do you have what it takes? Snow still blanketed the ground, and hard ice crunched underfoot, but spring was on its way. Ada's health was deteriorating. She got every ailment possible. Her teeth ached, her eyes swelled, her throat hurt. She was in so much pain that she wrote in her diary that if her body was found, all her belongings should go to her children. It was so bleak. Ada counted the days. It was the beginning of April. She had been at the camp with Knight for almost 3 months, and still, no sign of others returning. Calm down, lady. You gotta give them more than 3 months to walk 700 miles. She's expecting a phone call. This chick. You left camp in the Arctic and you didn't call me. Knight was growing weaker, and the shadow of death approached. Every day he would say something horrible to Ada. She tried her best to ignore him, but he attacked her at her lowest point. When she stopped in that morning to build the fire, Knight hissed at her. Blackjack was a good man. You should have been the one to die. You aren't good to me, Knight cried out, her face set in stone. No wonder your children don't care about you. The dark side of nature. People aren't always angels when they die. She had to clear her mind. She was still alive. If she stayed depressed in bed all day, she would wither away and never see her children again. Ada pushed herself up from her elbows, swung her feet over the edge of her bed, and made her way outside. By mid-June, the sun was getting stronger and the snow began to melt. The ice floes started to crack, and Ada could hear them moaning throughout the night. Ada decided to trek over to a little island where they first camped. She trapezed over the crunchy patches of snow. She was the only human soul on the island. She spotted a seagull nest and peeked to find 3 eggs inside. A slow smile spread across her face. She pocketed the eggs to eat them later. Goes back to camp, and Knight is dead.
Somebody once told me.
Now she's really alone. Ada, she takes Knight's rifle, and she kills a seal. On the way to get a poling line to drag the seal back to camp, Ada heard a strange noise as if thunder was rumbling. Above her the sky was clear, blue with few scattered clouds. She turned around and saw something that looked like a yellow ball of fur hurling towards her, and quickly realized it was a polar bear cub. 400 yards between her and the tent, Ada ran as fast as she could toward the opening before she could catch her breath. She grabbed her field glasses and climbed up to the high platform that she used as a bed. She nestled back into the side of the tent. Narrowing her eyes, she could make out the mother bear and her cub tearing apart the seal meat, bright red blood staining their snouts. Ada, starting to look like polar bear food. A few days later, the mother bear and cub came back sniffing around the tents. Ada grabbed the rifle and headed outside. If she got complacent and let them get comfortable, she knew eventually the polar bears would turn and attack her. It's time to stand your ground. Sure, you can make a kill, but can you protect it? She didn't want to injure them, so they would become enraged and charge at her. And then, bang, she shot into the air. USA. Gotta scare these goddamn polar bears away. The only thing they're good for is making us Coca-Cola. She stands her ground. Then, while she was preparing dinner inside the tent, she heard a particular noise that sounded like a whistle. Maybe it was a duck, Ada thought. It wasn't polar bears or seals. She knew their calls by now. She peered out of the tent, but it was foggy, and she couldn't see anything outside of the dense moisture. This time, she was certain it was a boat horn. Her heart leapt with excitement. She grabbed her field glasses and climbed out onto the platform, training her eyes outside. On the beach, people were milling around. Behind them, a boat was beached. The captain, a native man, got off the barge, wonder coloring his face that someone was on this desolate island. He looked at Ada and at the camp behind her inquisitively. Where are the rest of the people? He asked. I'm the only one left. Soul survival style. Ada braved the Arctic. Part 4. The Golden Road. This story comes from nowhere else than Israel. 2 black Israeli Apache helicopters soared the crisp blue September sky on an attack mission during the 2006 Lebanon War. For 33 days, Israel had been embroiled in bombing and launching rockets against Hezbollah. On the morning, the helicopters flew over the arid sparse hills of the Negev Mountains, southern Israel. Intent on their targets, the pilots didn't see the daily life that continued to unfold below. Those aren't people down there. They're goddamn targets. Helicopter. Then, in an instant, the helicopter's rotors spun out of control. The giant chopper crashed into each other. Upon impact, the Apaches burst into balls of flames and ejected the 2 pilots and navigators on board. The steel machines took nosedives, turning rapidly, spinning 6,000 feet until they collided into the scorched earth below. One of the co-pilots, Ram Kochach, died on the spot. The other 2 combatants were killed instantly, but Noam Gershoy, the 23-year-old survivor, pushed on. He was ejected from the cockpit and landed on a tan hillside, blood spilling from his injured body. Underneath the hot sun, he completely blacked out, the bodies of his compatriots beside him. The helicopter's blades revolved lazily until they completely stopped. Within hours, ambulances arrived to transport the shattered but surviving helicopter pilot to immediate medical care. But when they got there, Emergency workers found they could not yet move Noam because he was too injured. Almost every bone in his body was broken. A medical helicopter arrived and Noam was bundled into its fuselage. During the flight, his lungs collapsed, and the medical team had to make an emergency stop at Safed to revive him. 5 days passed before Noam opens his eyes. During that time, he lost a quarter of his body weight. His hospital gown hung on his gaunt frame. A dark growth covered his face. His jaw has been wired shut. His head was closely shaven. All his dark curly hair was gone now, and his normally tanned skin color was turned pale and pasty. He could not move. He could not feel his arms or legs. But, I thought war was like Fortnite. I thought you just respawn on the battle bus. War. War never changes. Everything had changed for Noam, who had spent the past 3.5 years not only as a helicopter pilot, but also a fan of high-risk sports such as bungee jumping, snowboarding, and riding bikes. 6 months later, after spending countless hours in bed surrounded by his 30 closest family members, Noam was released from the hospital. He was paralyzed, he couldn't walk, but determined to keep trying. Every day he would commute from his apartment to Beit Halakim to work with the on-site physical therapists, doctors, and staff members. Noam tried numerous other activities: wheelchair basketball, swimming, target shooting, but before his accident, Noam had taken 5 tennis lessons and really enjoyed the sport. He never imagined the next time he'd be playing, he'd be in a wheelchair. Tennis becomes Noam's rehab sport. By 2011, Noam became the first Israeli player to ever qualify for the Tennis Master Series in Belgium and won first place. Next up was the 2012 London Paralympics. On the day of Noam's match, Israel hadn't won any medals in the Olympics or gold in the Paralympics. Before the match, Noam listened to ethnic Jewish music to block out the intense pressure. Noam played increasingly better as the match wore on and was particularly strong with his returns. And then it was match point. Noam was playing so well that it took him just 20 minutes of tennis to get to that moment. With his right hand, he reached up and threw the ball into the air, the small green sphere spinning, and with his arm, smashed the serve into the corner of the court. Wagner never had a chance. The match was over, and Noam had won gold. Helicopter! Hava Nagila. That is the greatest survival stories. Peace in the Middle East. We're all survivors out here. Seriously, if you need a push on, a survival story will always pick you up. You want that adrenaline? You want that inspiration? Survive.